Right now, much of the world's attention is fixed on the escalating conflict involving Iran. News cycles are dominated by military operations, downed fighter jets, and dramatic rescue missions as tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran continue to unfold. When wars dominate the headlines, almost everything else fades into the background. But sometimes, the stories that receive the least attention are the ones that could shape our health and environment for generations. At the same time that global attention is focused on geopolitical conflict, lawmakers in Washington are debating yet another battle. This one is against a group of chemicals that scientists say may already be inside the bodies of most people on Earth. These chemicals are known as PFAS, often called forever chemicals. More than 12,000 varieties have been identified, used in everything from non-stick cookware and waterproof clothing to food packaging and industrial manufacturing. And because they don't easily break down, they accumulate in water, soil, wildlife, and in us. That is why lawmakers like McCollum and Durbin have reintroduced legislation aimed at phasing out many non-essential uses of PFAS and stopping their release into the environment. But while politicians debate regulations and industries argue over costs, scientists are quietly working on solutions. On a bright sunny day in Massachusetts, I visited the Toxins Use Reduction Institute that is better known as TURI, where researchers are trying to solve one of the biggest questions in the PFAS debate, which is what can we use instead? I spoke with several TURI scientists, including Greg and Gabriel, who are part of a growing effort to redesign the materials that make modern life convenient, but may also be silently contaminating our world. In this episode of Toxins, we explore the science, the politics, and the practical solutions behind the global challenge of forever chemicals. Because while wars may dominate today's headlines, the chemicals we release into our environment could shape the health of our planet for decades and centuries to come. Who has been at TURI the longest between you? Is it Greg or is it Gabriel?
It's close, but I think I got him beat.
When did you join, Greg?
Around 2005.
What about you, Gabriel?
2022.
Interesting. So who was working on PFAS the earliest among you?
I think we started together, right?
Yeah, no, I think you were working on PFAS before, right? You had this big replacement for the electronic industry.
Okay, so that started before you came on board?
Yep.
Okay, all right, I guess me.
Yeah.
Greg, let's start from there. How did you start working on PFAS?
Well, I mean, we're the Toxic Use Reduction Institute, and we focus on toxic chemicals. And several years ago, we recognized PFAS as an emerging chemical of concern. And about 4 years ago, we did a strategic planning process, and we determined that PFAS was definitely one of the areas that we knew we needed to provide some focused effort to address. So we put that in our strategic plan so that we kind of address PFAS across all the different programs at TURI. So the policy program, Gabriel and I, and the research program, the lab, etc. So we knew it would take a focused effort, and we had a target plan to address PFAS in all those areas. So I was involved in carrying out addressing PFAS for the research program. So what we did on an annual basis, the research program, we have an academic research grant program where every year we fund academic researchers at Massachusetts-based universities to conduct research into areas that require solutions to address toxic chemicals where there isn't a solution already available. So we need to develop something. So we put out a request for proposal every year to faculty members across the state, and we ask them for proposals to address different toxic chemicals and different applications of those chemicals. And then we have a review process where we select the best proposals and fund those grants for one academic year. And as a result of the strategic planning process that we did, where we knew we were going to focus on PFAS, for a couple of years, we just asked for proposals on PFAS and no other type of toxic chemicals. So that kind of jump-started us into that area. We are now back into an RFP process to do for PFAS and other types of chemicals as well. Initially, a few years ago, we decided to focus on PFAS. So one of the first proposals that we got for that PFAS was to address the use of PFAS as a surfactant used in etchant products. So these etching products etch away the photoresist on semiconductors. So it's used by semiconductor manufacturers. So we thought we had a good opportunity because the manufacturer of these etching solutions is, well, one manufacturer is located in Massachusetts. It's a company called Transcene. And we had a academic researcher, Professor Nagarajan from the Plastics Engineering Department at UMass Lowell, who partnered with the president of Transcene to try to help them to identify and evaluate safer alternatives to PFAS as a surfactant, these etching solutions. So that was a grant that we funded. And it turned out to be quite a successful project because we're able to identify safer alternatives and implement those safer alternatives.
Thanks, Greg, for taking us down memory lane. Currently, how does the team consider the way to deal with PFAS? Is it destruction or is it replacement? Or there is a lot of ecosystem being built, but they are still further away from being market ready. For instance, systems that remove it for PFAS from the water bodies and systems that also destroy it. So from your perspective and what your team is doing, what is your approach to dealing with PFAS?
Yeah, so basically TURI's overall approach is to eliminate the use of the chemical. So we kind of like to use the analogy of a pipe. So we're at the front end of the pipe, making sure that companies aren't using this chemical. So we don't have to worry about the other end of the pipe, whether it's going to air emissions, whether it's being dumped in water, whether it's going to sewer plants. We call that the end of the pipe. So to put filters on water supplies, that's an end of the pipe solution. To come up with ways to destruct PFAS that's out in the environment, that we call that end of the pipe solution. So we're front of the pipe solutions where we help companies stop using it so that we don't have to care about where it ends up because they're not using it to begin with.
Yeah, in the case of PFAS, even end of pipe solutions are no solution at all, because you have two different ways or two steps to get rid of PFAS. One is to remove PFAS from the effluent stream by absorption, removing from the stream so you can drop your effluent into the environment. But that doesn't destroy the PFAS. Especially PFAS is not being destroyed because it is super chemically resistant. So you need a second step of actual destruction, and that is super expensive. Sometimes it's impossible, or you really need to invest so much energy that is completely unfeasible. We are talking about trillions of dollars for getting rid one or two type of PFAS. If we factor in that there are 14,000 PFAS ever patented, and maybe now there will be between 200 and 500 PFAS in the market, thanks to finding alternatives that make PFAS not needed. So we came from 14,000 to 500 or 200. The economic equation that doesn't close. That's if we factor in end of pipe solutions that are no solution at all, then it makes much more sense to find alternatives to not use PFAS in first place.
So I'm curious, what options are available now? Gabriel, if you can give me the practical ones that you've successfully replaced so that I can have an idea of what the PFAS option was and what the replacement was. So let's have some case studies.
Well, PFAS has multiple applications, and I would like to make the comment here that, again, the user doesn't buy a chemical. The user wants an application. The user wants a specific standard to be addressed. So they don't need the chemical, they need the application. And PFAS has multiple applications that has to do with chemical resistance, like non-stick coatings, some also surfactants that work a lot, surfactants, some solvents, refrigerants, coolants, there are different, refrigerant gases that work, for example, in your fridge or in your air conditioning, coolants that could maybe cooling your computer now. We don't want those floating in your office or in your podcast place cooling your computer. It is not that it is the only option available. There are options available that are non-PFAS. So the idea is to identify what the user needs for a certain application, see what's out there, if there are options on the shelf, and compare. And what we do is an alternatives assessment. When there are options on the shelf, we perform what we call alternatives assessment. So we compare the alternatives if they are actually safer. That's the first question. No? Is it safer? Is it it performs well, it complies with performance standards, with the quality that the customer requires. And then, of course, if it is available, if it has some availability outside the laboratory, if it's on the shelf or not, how much does it cost? And sometimes you can get very good surprises, like Greg had with the surfactant, right, Greg?
Yes.
PFAS, it's also very expensive chemicals. So if you really hit something that is an alternative to PFAS, it is probably cost competitive most of the time.
Have we gotten to a point where we can say there are safer options for most PFAS at the moment?
No, we need to tackle one type of PFAS, one type of application at a time, unfortunately. So we help Transcene with the etchant products, and within their etchant products, there's 4 different types depending upon the substrate that they're working with. So whether the substrate's glass, chromium, aluminum, or photoresist, there are different types of etchant products that are used for those. So we kind of had to tackle all 4 of those applications, and we came up with different alternatives that work for each of those applications. So it's definitely going to take a concerted effort to go through all these different types of PFAS and how they're used, because the requirements for each application are somewhat different. So, you first have to find out what's driving the use of PFAS for that application, what properties of PFAS are important for that application. And then you can start to go about trying to identify and evaluate alternatives for that application.
Another issue that I want us to talk about is the scale of this replacement approach. Looking at what your team does and the market need for replacement approach. How can we talk about scaling up and ensuring that at least as many products as possible that can be successfully replaced with safer options are replaced? So what does your timeline looks like, and what are your thoughts regarding scaling this beyond TURI? Let me bring Gabriel in on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's one application at the time. At the same time, thankfully, we are not the only one finding alternatives to PFAS. There's a lot of market for alternatives to PFAS because the market for PFAS is relatively big. And then I would say our research grants and industry grant system, you can think of it as a seed investment, where a small amount of funding that we can afford to provide, plus the support from UMass Lowell, usually the researcher from UMass Lowell, and our support, that makes proof of concept and sometimes business cases, depending on the technology readiness level of the development. And from there, once it is demonstrated that the PFAS can be replaced, then that's what drives the scale up. So someone else takes the scale up. For example, Transcene, after finding this chemical for semiconductor manufacturing that requires a very precise, like a type of properties. Once the team found, the chemicals that could supply those set of very, very precise requirements, then the company decide to move forward with the scale up. In that case, it was kind of an easy decision, because the PFAS-based product was something like 2,000 or 2,400 per gallon, the PFAS product, and the new product was $80 per gallon. So scaling that up is kind of a no-brainer, right? From many point of view.
Anything to add, Greg?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally the challenge is most of the expenditures in this arena go towards the wrong end of the pipe. So they go in towards cleanup, filtering, pyrolysis, all this stuff, as opposed to funding the other end of the pipe with the work that we do. And once we come up with a solution, or a similar organization comes with a solution, it lasts forever. You're spending pennies on the dollar by going upstream and focusing on the use and finding out safer alternatives. We found this is a common theme. You look at carcinogens. We do a lot of work with chemicals that are carcinogens, and we find safer alternatives to them so that you stop using those carcinogens in products. However, 98% of the funding for carcinogens is on research for the treatment of or screening of cancer in patients. So it's just fundamentally a challenge that we're just not seeing the focus on the prevention or the front end of this. Because what we do at TURI, we're basically taking chemistry knowledge and combining it with industry knowledge, with basically looking at alternatives and evaluating alternatives and coming up with safer solutions. So it's just a matter of putting that effort. I mean, there's industry experts for every one of these applications. There's industry experts. There's a number of people that understand chemistry and work in academic departments. So it's not like we have some unique winning combination. This can be scaled up. It just needs the focus and attention. And this transcene work was kind of a good illustration, as, if you just do business as usual, keep using the PFAS and don't look at your options, they wouldn't have realized that instead of spending $2,400 per gallon for these PFAS surfactants, they could only be spending $80 per gallon. But, it took a little bit of work and research and evaluation to find that out. But it just also proves that the safer solutions are not always more expensive. We try as a goal to find alternatives that are either less expensive or comparable. Those are what we consider successful alternatives.
Gabriel, how do you see the best approach to tackling PFAS?
Yeah, basically closing the tap, really, because they last forever, and it is super expensive to get rid of. On top of that, there's a lot of economic damage and public health damage from exposure that's never factored into any economic equation. So I think the best way is to basically not use PFAS at all for any application. Really, our work and the work of others are increasingly demonstrating that yes, it provides good properties, but the downside is too expensive, it's too costly, not only economically, at the public health level. And yeah, now we are also working on textiles, you need, people need repellent textiles that could repel water, that could repel oil, they can be cleaned more easily. And there are other chemistries. There are other chemistries out there that they require a little bit of attention and a little bit of investment in such a way that we don't need to care about all the other expensive end of pipe solutions. The approach is basically find alternatives to PFAS, because first of all, we didn't sign up for the downside of PFAS. No consumer signed up for the downside of PFAS. So if I am telling you, okay, you have this super repellent jacket and stuff, but you and your children are going to drink PFAS water, forever, and you will have to, otherwise you have to spend trillions of dollars to remove and destroy those PFAS. Would you buy PFAS coatings? No one tells you that, right? Up front. So you have to discover it after the fact. There are other chemistries that are good enough, because you don't need a bulletproof vest. You need something that repels water a little bit, so you don't get wet below your jacket, So, and how much do you need that? Maybe 5 minutes from going, to take the bus or to go to do the groceries or stuff like that, or stepping down from your car and walking, 10 meters, 100 meters. So you don't need really a bulletproof test or something out of this world. So there are chemistries that are more than good enough, and yeah, they should be more let's say, more promoted, and we should factor in all the damages, the damages economically, because fresh water, it's an economic good, and we are damaging it, right? On top of the public health, on top of the generational health, of next generations.
Yeah. What do you think, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Gabriel said. The other thing I just saw a special on farms being contaminated with PFAS, and they're like contaminated forever because they were using sewage sludge as a fertilizer. And it happened to have PFAS in it. Now the complete farm is contaminated and has to be shut down. I still feel we're seeing just the tip of the iceberg as to what these impacts are going to be. And again, by turning off the tap, we call it either elimination or substitution with something safer. And that's the approach that we really want to adopt. It makes a lot of sense, especially for these forever chemicals, because you're talking about a small expenditure up front to evaluate alternatives and implement alternatives, as opposed to a lifelong exposure to these in the environment. And another key success factor, I think, is to have an industry partner that's involved in the evaluation of alternatives. Because without that, you're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit. And, you can do research online and find out what the requirements are for that application, but you never can substitute having industry experts that are actually manufacturing products with the PFAS chemical and explaining to you exactly why it's used and exactly what the parameters are and requirements. You could think you have a great solution in the lab. Look, I mix this and together and it works great. And it stays stable. I've been doing it for weeks and it stays stable. And then you find out that the requirement is it needs stability for a 3-year period. It's not stable after 3 months. All of a sudden, the solution you think is great is not great. And there's just so many examples of that. So just having an industry partner really define and explain what the critical performance requirements are for that application really is essential to come up with a successful alternative.
The argument in favor of replacement seems very, very straightforward, turning off the tap. But we have industries that probably theoretically safer options are not available. So how would you describe the current landscape of industry partnership in pursuing this approach? Who wants to take that? Should I start with Gabriel?
Yeah, I mean, people claiming that they are not available options, they speak of their ignorance, right? And sometimes it's an ignorance that is hiding the fact that there are safer alternatives because it's hurting a business, right? But at the same time, when electricity came, no one cried for the candle, the candle industry, So it is something like this, like if there is something that is really, really useful, but the counterpart is so costly that when you factor everything, it is something like an economic burden for the global society, then you have to cut the chase and find an alternative. And then ask yourself, do I really need this debate of essential use? There are uses, of course, like maybe medical devices, certain type of refrigeration, I don't know, some protection of, from weather and stuff like that maybe they are essential up to a point, but beyond that point, maybe it's not necessary, and we can live without that application too. So we have that, Even before finding alternatives, ask yourself if you really need it. If you say, okay, I really need this application, then ask yourself, is PFAS the only chemistry that can provide that service? The answer is most likely no. And that's why, in less than maybe 1 decade, where everything, came up from the PFAS started to be an issue in Vox Populi. In less than 10 years, they came from 10,000 PFAS in the market to 500 to 200. And those, of course, they are the hardest applications maybe to compete with PFAS. But that doesn't mean that there are no chance to compete against that, and it is not necessarily necessary too. So we have to really dig into that more often as a consumer too.
So what do you want to add, Greg? I can see you're nodding.
Yeah. So As far as industry participation, we see common themes with PFAS and with other toxic chemicals. Some companies are leaders in this area, some are laggards. There's a number of factors that kind of drive that. One is, market drivers. So if customers are asking them for PFAS free, that's going to carry a lot more weight with companies to make the investments to go PFAS free. Another one is obviously regulatory drivers, and we're starting to see some of that take place now. Like as a good example, like a lot of times there's a reluctance to put a regulation in without a known alternative, a validated alternative in place. So if the regulation comes first, we call that technology driving regulation. So you give like 5 or 6 years to come up with a solution, but you need to do it by this deadline. We saw that with lead-free electronics. So that was a regulation passed in Europe. So, but it had implications around the world because companies in the electronics industry that, make computers and workstations, they're selling globally. So if Europe passes this regulation and you're manufacturing anywhere in the world, you're going to have to deal with that because some portion of your market is in Europe, and it's really not cost effective to have multiple manufacturing lines, one for leaded products and one for lead-free products. So it really forced the whole industry to come up with lead-free solutions for the electronics industry. And I remember when this first came about that there was so much backlash from many people in industry saying it's impossible, we can't do it. There's going to be planes falling out of the sky when the circuit boards fail on the planes. I'm not going to get on a plane. Nuclear facilities are going to fail because the electronics are going to fail in there. So there was just a lot of resistance to it. But the regulation was passed and companies had to deal with it, and they had a deadline. And lo and behold, we found solutions that worked. We validated those solutions and we implemented those solutions, and no planes fell out of the sky and no nuclear plants, melted down. So, ideally, we'd like to see something like that with PFAS, some type of technology forcing. You really force the funds, the expenditures, and the effort to be finding safer alternatives. And that's a great way to do that.
A quick follow-up. Do you think with that force, if the force and motivation is there, do you think science can catch up and solve these problems once and for all?
Yeah. Yes. We proved it, with the work with Transcene and the electronics industry, a very complicated application, semiconductor manufacturing, very precise, challenging requirements, and we're able to do it in that environment. So, we feel confident that with the right focus and effort, we can find safer alternatives for other applications.
Yes, of course. It's a matter of focus. Talking about lead free, you can go even before that. The leaded gas, leaded oil, like for gas, like fuel was something that we never needed it. The tetraethyl lead, we never needed tetraethyl lead. We could always use ethanol for anti-kick. You see. So I think all of those things, the same with CFCs, now HFCs, now we have HFO, F gases for refrigeration. They are made in the same facilities that make PFAS. And also they are used to make other PFAS. So we have this, we found that the CFCs damage the ozone hole. And then we came up with the HFCs. Now the HFCs, we found that they have a super high global warming potential. In Kigali, the Montreal Protocol was amended, reduce the use of HFCs because they have a climate impact. And now there is the next generation of F gases are HFOs that become trifluoroacetic acid in the environment. Trifluoroacetic acid is the shortest chain PFAS you can have, right? It is soluble in water, it is super chemically resistant, and it accumulates so much. Of course, people, you will hear, no, well, but TFA is not PFOA, it's not as toxic as PFOA, but we are emitting so much TFA that we still are over the toxicity threshold of TFA. So it doesn't matter that it's friendlier than PFOA. We are still, accumulating so much in the environment that we are having, exposure over threshold. So that's a part that matters. And it is not that we need this new generation of F gases. We can really use other gases to provide the same service, which is refrigeration, air conditioning and stuff like that. There are technologies that are out there, completely available, completely cost effective to provide the same service. It's not that we need to fall again, in the same with the same mistake. We can really be PFAS free in that, and that's a huge scale, because it's a worldwide. PFAS gases, F gases is probably the biggest market for fluorinated chemicals right now. It's like a 10 times or more than 10 times the rest of the PFAS, fluoropolymers and stuff like that. Like F gases is more than 10 times the market size. And we can not just replace with something else and forget about the other ones, because we have already, we don't even need the research, because the research is already implemented, it's already applied, and it has market readiness level. You see?
Okay, thank you very much. So what are you working on right now that's especially in this area of PFAS that you could consider promising?
Well, talking about refrigerant gases, I just published alternatives assessment on refrigerant gases. It's available
really?
it's available in our website.
What about you, Greg? What are you optimistic about that you still believe could make a lot of difference coming from your team?
Right now, we are working PFAS-free initiatives. One is we are partnering with a company in Massachusetts that uses PFAS-coated textiles, and we are looking specifically at automobile applications and that use heavy-duty fabrics for convertible tops. And these need to be both water resistant for the weather and also need to be oil and stain resistant. So we have some candidates that we are pretty excited about that are getting closer and closer to the performance of the PFAS-based coatings. So this is one area that we have ongoing. We also have another area of research that is looking at PFAS-coated food wrap. So, if you ever see that, like a Big Mac or whatever, wrapped in that paper that's nice and waxy, that doesn't stick and resists stains. And a lot of the food wrap does contain PFAS coatings. So we are looking at some bio-based alternatives to replace the PFAS-coated food wrap with much safer alternative materials to try to provide the same oil and water resistance.
I'm just trying to take a look at the report. So how long did it take to put together?
Well, it's a little bit long. It was a very, took some time to be crafted, but it's very comprehensive. So we start with, all the regulations that drive the change, the recent changes in the refrigerant gas landscape that pushes, the industry to innovate and to provide alternatives. One of those alternatives are, again, F gases, but they are not the only alternatives out there. So what we do is we start asking the safety question, right? So are the alternatives safer than before? And we delve into environmental impact, human health impact, health hazards, degradation products in the environment, including TFA, the impact of TFA as a degradation product. Then we implement a system that we have in-house here at TURI, the P2ASIS, the Pollution Prevention Option Analysis System, where we take different aspects of the chemicals, effects on human health, acute and chronic, ecological hazard, environmental fate and transport, atmospheric hazard, physical properties, life cycle factors, and we assign a score. We assign a score from low, medium, high, or very high hazard, and we found that the non-F gases tend to have much lower overall hazard levels. And then after that, after discussing all of this, we delve into the performance assessment. Why we need refrigerant gases in first place? What are we asking to these refrigerant gases? Like the cooling capacity, net refrigeration efficiency, refrigeration effect, all the properties that make a refrigerant gases a compelling business case, right? And then you have two options. You have two options. So for alternatives to adopt an alternative, you either keep your equipment and just change the gas, like filling up the gas. That's called retrofitting. So keeping your old equipment, or buying a new equipment that works with a new refrigerant. And we found that retrofitting all the equipment, it's a short-term fix, but you lose energy efficiency because newer equipments are usually more energy efficiency, so energy efficient, and that aspect is a good compelling case to renew your equipment if you can. And then we discuss all the options, how they play in the different subspaces of refrigeration, mobile, commercial, residential, and which we try to link which option can work in which application. And then at the end, we do an economic assessment. We find for prices, availability, economics in general, the impact of energy efficiency, the impact of the return of investment for new equipment, social costs associated with the climate impact, socioeconomic impact of water pollution. No, all of these numbers I just mentioned, they are there, in section 4, economic assessment, and then we make a summary of all, and we found that HFOs, this new generation, this fourth generation of F-gases, are potentially a regrettable alternative, and for two reasons. First, because there are non-F gases that are available at the right market readiness and completely useful for the application. And second, because all the downside of TFA pollution, PFAS pollution, and also some environmental justice aspects of producing the F gases that affect what we call the fence-like communities, the communities that live in the surrounding area of a production facility. HFCs, HFOs, they use carbon tetrachloride, perchloroethylene as precursors. Even if you have the most perfect new facility, at some point, human error and management error could lead to leaks and emissions. And those emissions go, of course, to the environment and affect the nearby communities. And the EPA found out that there are actually excess cancer risk in those communities. So we point out that, the life cycle, like factor in all the life cycle when it comes to adopting an alternative. Not only the application, not only the cost of the application or the cost of the chemical on the shelf, also the cost of the supply chain, right? All of these things. So,
what are your expectations with this policy document, with this report?
Yeah, this report is intended to inform policymakers, stakeholders, people that are adoptants of these technologies, to say, okay, so these are the options you have, and these are the downsides, the pros and cons of the different options you have. So that's basically the message.
So, Greg, looking at how the the sector and this approach has evolved over the years. Are you optimistic, or how would you describe the trend so far?
I'm optimistic that given the right attention and focus that we can be successful in these areas. However, I am somewhat not as optimistic that we're going to see the shift from cleanup to prevention that's really needed to be effective in this area. So anything you can do or others can do to try to get that message out of the resources that are spent on the prevention and the multiplier factor that occurs with those to help policymakers would be extremely helpful.
What about you, Gabriel?
Yeah, I am optimistic. It is funny because I'm from the global south. These high technologies based on PFAS, they are not super available in the global south as in here in the global north. So we have the option not to make the same mistake. And now I think that now that the global south is slowly taking some, getting more advanced technologically, we can skip the PFAS chapter and jump directly into safer alternatives. So we have this kind of hidden blessing of lagging behind. That now that we are catching up, we can say, okay, we can catch up, but in a safer way, right? We don't need to be exposed to these chemicals because we already know that there are safer chemicals.
I like the way you described it. I think the advantage of slow development is that.
It's funny, right?
How do you feel about that response?
No comment.
So, what are your last remarks for me, Greg? Any last words?
I guess, it's just discouraging when you hear different industries say it's going to take 20 years to come up with alternatives, and we've been able to do it, electronics industry for that surfactant application in less than 18 months. So I really, when we hear such proclamations like that aren't based on facts, we really want to try to drive home that it is possible and it can be done in abbreviated timeframes with the right focus and dedication to look at these things instead of just doing business as usual.
Thanks, Greg. How about you, Gabriel?
Yeah, I mean, again, PFAS people that are invested in the PFAS industry, they are going to tell you that if you don't adopt PFAS technologies, you're going to come back to the caveman, stuff like that. And I would say if we keep using PFAS, we will come back to the caveman, and at least the caveman had clear water, right? Clear water to drink. You see, so I don't know how I feel if I want to come back to that or not. And even it's not even necessary, really, to keep on the technology advances. We can advance without affecting the public health and the communities that much. There are options out there, and we can adopt them, and they are available, and they are as good as any of the other PFAS.
But I think this has been an exciting conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Keep
Thank
on.
you very much. I really enjoyed this
Okay.
conversation.